fortune is good for something. This is more or less how the early chronicles of Islam extolled the defeat at Uhud. While the triumph at Badr had strengthened the faithful, it lulled them into forgetting about forming a real army. Seeking revenge for Badr, the Meccans led several thousand men to Uhud, close to Medina. The Prophet's army overestimated its strength and was defeated, even though it had enlisted mercenaries commanded by heroes from the earlier Meccan campaign, such as Omar and Hamza, Mohammed's young uncle. Hamza fell in this battle, killed by a slave with no other stake in the whole thing than buying his freedom.
After the defeat at Uhud, Mohammed set out to neutralize the second Jewish tribe, the Nadir, again on a minor pretext. A ransom had to be paid, and Mohammed appealed to the Nadir chief for a contribution. Given that the Jews now belonged to the Ummah, the new social structure established by Mohammed at Yathrib.
The Jews, the Nadir leaders, replied, "Abu al-Qasim, we grant you the aid you request." So they agreed to pay, to help out.
Mohammed was sitting with his closest advisors when suddenly he got up and left. The others followed, asking, "Where are you going?"
He replied, "I have received a visit from my brother Gabriel. He has informed me they are plotting against me."
And then he said, "I have learned that the Jews are planning my death." So he declared war and surrounded them, and history repeated itself. The Jews were counting on their allies, who did nothing, and they were forced to surrender.
After defeating them, he gave them a choice between submitting to his authority or being expelled. They chose to leave Medina and emigrate. Some emigrated to Khaybar, while others went to Syria, Palestine, and Iraq.
The Jews surrendered. But unlike the last time, they weren't given the opportunity to sell their possessions. He let them leave with only their personal effects. They were forced to abandon their land. In one fell swoop, he had rid himself of the Nadir and secured a homeland for the emigrants.
One day, the Prophet needed to correspond with a prominent figure and went to see his freed slave, Zayd, now his adopted son. Mohammed found only Zayd's wife, Zainab, who received him. The Messenger of God had previously felt an aversion to this woman, but seeing her this time, he was seduced. He said, "Oh, how the transcendence of God inverses the heart's inclinations." He declined Zainab's proposal to stay and wait for Zayd, and he left. When her husband returned, Zainab told him about the words of the Messenger of God. Zayd was edified by this, and God triggered antipathy in his heart for his spouse, so that he turned away from her. Zayd went to see the Prophet and said, "O Messenger of God, I wish to separate from my wife. She's too noble for me, and this is hurtful to me." "Keep your wife and fear God," recommended the Prophet. Nevertheless, Zayd ended up divorcing her. Zainab, the daughter of a noble tribe, was very generous with the most disenfranchised. She even worked to distribute aid to the destitute. Aisha said that Zainab was the most beautiful and desirable of her whole entourage. Although Zainab was much older than Aisha, in her 40s by this time, they shared a great complicity. Months later, in a state of divine inspiration, God scolded his prophet to go and confront his desire. And the order was given to accept marriage to Zainab. Thus the prophet summoned Zayd and said to him, I trust no one more than you. Go in my name and ask for the hand of Zainab. At Zainab's house, Zayd found her kneading bread and broke the news to her. The joyful Zainab said grace to God in a prayer. Zamakchari, 12th century.
C'est à cette occasion que Aïcha, son autre épouse, lui a raconté.
On this occasion, Aisha, one of his other wives, said to him jokingly, Your God's revelations are much to your benefit.
Tous ces mariages de Mohammed,
All of Muhammad's marriages, according to the historians, were political.
Il s'agit d'autre chose.
The Zainab episode was different in that Muhammad's desire broke the law. It's interesting to observe the prophet, this man assuming his transgression, assuming his desire through transgression. And in this episode, we see the emergence, through this desire, of an absolute, a kind of transcendence. In Surah 33, the factions, the revelation is ambiguous. The first verses state that Muhammad is the father of none among your men, and that the Quran rules over the prohibition of adoption and the naming of children. The latter blurs lineage and the logic of inheritance. This surah also concerns married couples and the dress code for women.
In the early days of Islam, the veil was not enforced as strictly as it is today. The veil was a woman's right. She was free to decide on her own when and where she wore it.
The surah of the veil, hijab, came down on the day of his marriage to Zainab.
A companion of the Prophet's wives had gone out during the night to relieve herself. Some men approached her and molested her, and the Prophet began to worry.
It was after this incident that the Prophet received the verse that led him to veil his wives, that is, to forbid them from fraternizing with other men.
Let's talk about mixed worship. There are thousands of mosques in the Muslim world, but we have only inherited one mosque that remains exactly as it was in the Prophet's time. That is the Kaaba mosque. This is the only mosque where mixed worship is permitted. Women circle the